Welcome. Thrilled to be joined by Boyd, Francis, and Mason on the 45th anniversary of the Fourth World Literature Conference that was held April 26th of 1981 in Santa Monica, California. This conference was hoped to result in a ready-to-publish book for Narcotics Anonymous. And we're doing this deep dive into this conference for those who are interested in learning more about it. It's not the level of detail that we go into when doing a general history of the basic text, and looking forward to their contributions to this conversation. I'm going to start off with a review of the Third World Lit Conference. As a reminder, the members at this conference in Memphis, they worked tirelessly both during this conference, but also afterwards, where they worked to produce, print, bind, and mail out the Memphis Review Form, also referred to as the Gray Review Form. And with that was instructions given to the fellowship that they had until April 15th of 1981 to review the draft and submit input. And again, the hope was that the book would be approved at the 1981 World Service Conference, and that they'd be using the Fourth World Lit Conference simply to incorporate that input from what was considered to be a almost ready to publish book. The criteria for completion, and this was something that Bo had sent out to the fellowship April 1981. He referenced that this Fourth World Lit Conference would be coming up in the Los Angeles area, and that they'd be incorporating input into the basic text. And our position of direct responsibility to those we serve and our certainty that the material can and will be completed has led us to consider the following criteria. This is criteria for completion. We feel the book will be complete when, one, it contains all the things we do to get clean, stay clean, and help others. Two, this material is accurate in terms of the written and spoken traditions of NA recovery. Three, there has been fellowship-wide review and input over enough time for sincere NA members to respond. Four, it is found to be free of plagiarism. And five, readability and literary style will never be complete to everyone's satisfaction. So as a reminder, we did a deep dive into the Third World Lit Conference for the 45th anniversary, and that was accompanied by a episode of the Living Clean podcast with Francis and Mason. Francis and Mason, you guys have also recorded a special episode for the 45th anniversary of the Fourth World Lit Conference. Do you want to just acknowledge who the guests were?
Yeah, we brought in a couple of Californians to interview. We felt like we've been using several of the members from the other episodes that were kind of core members of the literature movement, and we wanted to get a view of some of the participants that came from California to participate. So we had Bob S. and Kathy M. Participate in this podcast for the Fourth World Literature Conference.
We're
Both of Southern California.
really excited about that. We'll have this YouTube presentation, the Living Clean podcast episode, and a blog on preserving the message for anyone interested in learning more about this specific part of the history of the writing of the basic text. Newsletter communication, we've emphasized previously, was important. And there was a newsletter out of Lincoln, Nebraska that was called The Paper, and I've asked Mason to read through it.
All right. So the book is now in the hands of the fellowship for review, comment, and approval. The comments and changes suggested by the fellowship will be acted on at the Fourth World Literature Conference to be held April 25th through the 29th in Venice, California. For now, get involved in the review work on the book. Contact your area service group and find out how it's being done. In the Lincoln area, the review workshop is being held on Thursday nights at 7 at the Cleanway Club, 2708 Wash Street, alleyway entrance. And this is from Doug W.
Thanks, Mason. Francis, can you talk a little bit about newsletters and their role during the writing of the basic text and also their role in communication in the early 80s?
Well, we noticed in the First World Literature Conference, they had a workshop on newsletters, and then that literature conference produced the handbook for NA literature. And so it was kind of like a manual on what we needed to do to support the writing of the basic text. And so there was a piece in there about newsletters, and there were a lot of newsletters that kind of cropped up in the United States following that First World Literature Conference and the production of that handbook. And so we see several newsletters becoming a hub for communication on the writing of the basic text. The Mid America newsletter, the Mainline newsletter out of Northern California, and the Rainbow Connection. I've been like looking at these newsletters for a long time and pulling a lot of history out of it. And it's kind of almost like the social media of the day, like people post flyers on Facebook now. It's hard to find a paper flyer like where I live because it's all on social media. But really, this is how people announce their events and things that were happening around the United States. So newsletters, social media, like
Yeah,
much slower, but important. Thanks.
these are a rich source of information from an archival perspective. So encourage anyone that's got newsletters from their local area or region to get those things digitized and preserved. I think the other thing that stands out about this is it says that the Lincoln area, they have a review workshop happening on Thursday nights. And so Boyd and I have been pretty clear in describing that when we present a history of the basic text, it's based on what we know from those who attended the World Lit conferences through minutes and so forth, a little bit known about those who didn't, who are part of local literature committees, but trying to learn more about the members of NA whose name will never appear in anything, but were involved with doing the work to review what had been put together and provide feedback in advance of the Fourth World Lit Conference. This is the flyer, and it's going to highlight a couple things for the continuation of the effort to new literature for the Fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous, that others may find the freedom of recovery we have found. Originally was kind of looked at to be a 4-day conference. It actually turned into a 6-day conference, and it was held in Santa Monica at the Retail Clerks Union Hall. You've seen the book, and the time has come to be or not to be, to do or not to do. Then kind of emphasizes that desire to see the book published. And we want our book. How about you? Interestingly, I'm going to play a little audio clip with the quote at the top.
You know, I said many, many times a long time ago that a man without a dream is only half a man, and a fellowship without a vision is a farce. I still believe that.
So that audio is from the 20th anniversary talk, and it's Jimmy talking in August of 1973. And it's not an exact word for word quote from the audio, but it is something that Jimmy spoke about 8 years earlier. And was showing up here on the flyer, and to me just kind of speaks to his influence and involvement. There's a gentleman named Nolan W. who is from Venice. He got clean in 1971. He attended the Third World Lit Conference in Memphis and chaired the host committee for the Fourth World Lit Conference, and enjoy seeing him on roller skates. I think he was probably the sole member of the Lit Committee that was rolling around the room that way. There are 145 people that attended based on the minutes that we've reviewed. They came from 15 different states. What's really kind of important with this, though, is that 81% of those people attending were attending their first World Lit Conference. And of those attending their first World Lit Conference, 92% were from California. So only 4 members from California had attended a prior World Lit Conference. And in many ways, one way to think about the Fourth World Lit Conference is the California Fellowship meets the World Literature Committee. We're going to listen to a couple of reflections from California members on this. One is from Nikki, who is a member from Bellflower. She attended the 4th, 5th, and 6th World Lit Conferences. She passed May 16th, 2025. And we'll listen to her reflections. Just a shout out to Frances, who was provided the kind of motivation and impetus for interviewing folks back in 2021 when COVID was going on. And, just very thankful for his initiative around this because it gave us opportunities to collect stories like we're hearing here from Nikki.
We had an area meeting and we had the gray books with us and we were talking in our area. And people had kind of glanced at that book and they wanted to send someone because the vote was for them to not be writing the book again. And that vote was because people really didn't know that wasn't it, that they didn't know that it wasn't complete. Well, what happened was I showed up in Santa Monica, and when I got there, I was surprised to see how many people were there and how many people I didn't know. But I found a seat, and the tables were in a complete circle around the whole big room, and there were people at every table. So I'm sitting there, and I'm like halfway, directly opposite Bo. As each person talked about their area and the state they came from and the area they came from and how they didn't have meetings and how they didn't have a book and how they didn't have something to take to the newcomer who was brand new, and sometimes they would drive 200 miles to a meeting, Mississippi to Louisiana, different places like that. And I was so used to California where even though we were starting meetings, in a half an hour I could be somewhere. And then eventually towards that time, I could be at a meeting every single day and not have to drive that far. And so for me, it was a shock to hear that there weren't meetings like that everywhere else. I thought that it was the same everywhere. And to hear each one of these people talk, by the time they got to me, I was in tears because I realized that addicts were dying and that we needed to carry the message better. And the only way to do that would be the way that the forefathers of the other program had done it, and to write a book that could be sent anywhere and could be read by that new addict at 3 o'clock in the morning when he or she didn't want to call someone. I left there. I drove home. I was living in Long Beach by then, and packed all my things, just stayed there for the whole week, quit my job, and stayed there for that whole week, and just dedicated myself, committed myself to do whatever I needed to do, whatever talent I had, to this effort to create a book for addicts, by addicts.
You guys want to jump in with any reflections on what Nikki was sharing?
Well, Chris, for me, it speaks to a couple of things. First of all, one of the things is, something we still experience today, which is communication issues. Because Nikki was talking about how in her home area, they thought that the Gray Review form was actually the book that was going to be published, and their vote was to, no, do not publish this. And, that really and truly speaks to some of the same stuff that we have, like I say, that continues, which is communication issues. The other thing is, Nikki, she came down to Santa Monica. She got very much caught up into the movement, the literature movement, and she was very enamored with what was going on, and ended up quitting her job, coming back and staying there to the conference. And I know I think she attended the 5th and 6th literature conferences, and got involved with the writing of our basic text. So,
yeah, I think it speaks to the power of engagement, of actually interacting with people. Her frame for thinking about the fellowship was based on what her experience was, and for her to be kind of surprised to learn that it wasn't like that everywhere else was like an awakening of sorts, in a positive way, to recognize that her experience wasn't a universal experience, that there weren't meetings available so readily as she had in her experience.
Yeah, I just want to speak to the fact of or to these members that were driving these great distances that really opened her eyes. And, like it just brings about a sense of gratitude, particularly in the area that I'm in. Had it not been for those sort of members driving those great distances, I don't know if NA would have gained any traction, particularly in this region of the country. And I know that those stories are just as powerful to a lot of folks as it was to Nikki.
Thanks, Mason.
I
So
wanted
Sally,
to
good, Francis.
I wanted to acknowledge just how meaningful those interviews were for me, and like kind of like the highlight of my recovery, getting to hear those stories. But like hearing what it was like back then was really kind of interesting. Like, and how entitled perhaps I am with the availability of Narcotics Anonymous. And, like the continuing interviews that Mason and I do for the podcast, like we find out what kind of growth happened after the writing of the basic text. Like that people don't have to drive that far anymore, because like all of a sudden the fellowship has sprung up as a result of getting this book. And because addicts were dying. But now, like there's hope for addicts, because, like we have literature available to them when they're in jail or at their local library or wherever it is that you can find a book. Thanks.
Standing on the shoulders of those who came before us and repaying that debt by making sure that things are available for the next person. Sally E. got clean in 1969. She's from California. She was on the board of trustees, attended the 4th, 5th, and 6th World Lit Conferences, died just shy of her 45th anniversary in 2014. And this is her talking about the 4th World Lit Conference and her experience with that at the 11th World Convention of NA, which was in Miami, Florida in September of 1981. The audio is not great, so pay attention to the subtitles to complement what she's saying.
In May of this year, they held the end of April of this year, they held a literature conference in Santa Monica. And I had seen a copy of the gray book that came out of Memphis, and I didn't like it. And I had some real strong opinions, because I'm very opinionated about that. Well, one of the things I really learned in freshman English composition was that committees can't write books. And I really believe that. But anyway, I had some opinions about that they needed some professional writers. They needed a professional writer, a professional editor, and a professional proofreader. And I did a lot of bitching and griping about it. And my friend Bob told me, you better go down and tell them. And I wasn't anxious to do that, but we were at a regional service meeting, and Bob says, I'm going to Lit Conference. Why don't you come tell them what you got to tell them? I said, okay. So we got down there, and I got inside, and I was looking around for who to tell. I wasn't quite sure who to approach with these pearls of wisdom. And somebody said, do you type? And I said, look at my fingernails. I don't type. And they said, well, can you read? So I ended up sitting on a proofreading, on an input form reading committee where input from all over the country had been sent in regarding the book. And I found out that there were a lot of people that really loved that book. And I tend to nitpick something to death. And I took a little look at that. And then I became involved in the process. And I was working like I was working a 40-hour week that week, and I would go to work, and I would watch the clock till 5 o'clock. I would get off and go down to Santa Monica and work till 2 or 3 in the morning. Something happened for me at that late conference. And I know today that committees cannot write books, that God can work in tools.
Guys, why don't you jump in with some observations or reflections on what Sally had to share?
Yeah, Mason and I recently did an episode on the Fourth World Literature Conference with Bob S. and Kathy M. And, they talked about going to the conference when they got off of work and putting time in. And one of the it changed my mind about this conference because, one, I'm from California, but when I looked at the numbers about how many people showed up from California, I thought they were tourists. But what Bob and Kathy were talking about is that the people from California wanted to contribute to the book, but they worked, they were working people, and so they would show up after they got off work and put as much time in as they could donate. And so I thought that was kind of meaningful. I kind of really feel like the literature movement changed a lot of hearts and minds about what was happening with the book in Southern California. But I also think that the people that showed up to contribute to the book from Southern California may have changed some hearts and minds of the people that were involved in the literature movement. So thanks.
Thanks, Francis. Boyd?
Well, yeah, Chris, it's the point I'll bring up is what you actually had shared earlier with this is that, it's very obvious that Sally had some pretty strong opinions before she actually got to the conference, which lends itself a little bit to contempt prior to investigation. But it's very obvious that when she got to the conference and started participating, that it's very obvious the bug caught her, and because she became, quite involved with the literature movement and attended the next two conferences, 5 and 6 itself, and her, mind changed. So I think that's also, both her and Nikki, it changed them very much so to where they wanted to participate in it. And I don't know. The only thing I can think of is that's just pretty cool.
Mason, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I find it fascinating that her concern was not really irrational, but it was practical, and I think the deeper lesson is in her like eventual transformation, like Boyd was speaking to, and this idea that committees can't write a book, but something larger can happen through like this sincere group effort. Like there's some miracles that happen when we get together and we take an imperfect like human process, but when we're guided by spiritual principles, some really amazing things can come out of that.
Yeah, focus on a higher calling or a greater good to bring people together. What I like in this is first the question, can you type? And then like the next question is, can you read? And like that wasn't a presumptuous question or a condescending type question. It was a real legitimate question about trying to understand the skills and capabilities of the people showing up to help out. And they found ways for anybody to be involved, whether they could read or not. And so again, this was a very inclusive process of literature creation. When we get into the minutes, we'll spend some time now just kind of describing what was going on at the conference. On day one, they talked about developing an approach that was a repetitive cycle of evaluation and refinement, where input from the Memphis Review Forum was systematically improvised, typed, and proofread, with each version being funneled back through successive editing workshops to undergo multiple drafting stages until a final corrected review is achieved. So this is a very laborious process. This was not subject to one person's kind of preference, but very much committee oriented, as has been referenced by both Sally and Mason, and involved taking both input that had been submitted prior to the conference based on the Gray review form or Memphis review form, as well as feedback that was coming up in those work sessions. And so if we look at the actual minutes, it has an outline of 1, review input; 2, improvised reviews, restructure, reword, correct; 3, type; 4, proofread, edit, correct, and review; and then back to the edit workshop, type again, proofread, edit, review; back to editing workshop, type, proofread, edit, review. And do this all the way through till you get the draft that feels correct. So a very intentional and thoughtful approach to making sure that it reflected those criteria that Bo had outlined for the book to be considered complete. There were 3 basic sources of material for the groups to work on. 1, the text; 2, the input forms that had accompanied the Gray review forms; 3, files. And then you would have been assigned to one of 3 groups. You were in the reading and evaluation group, the editing group, or the paper handling group. If we look at this slide, this is written into the minutes, but it reflects what was on the blackboard. And so on the blackboard, it said divide input, specific pages and lines, as well as general input; divide specific into chapters, read general input. And then this process of reading old files, new input, general input, stories, new text; edit specific input to text; type, copy the file; proofread, new input, back to read. This is a photo from the Fourth World Lit Conference, and you can see folks reading through the Memphis review form, as well as having additional materials to help them look at the input that's being submitted and how to document and track that. We get a status report on day 2 in the minutes, and the chapters 1 through 10 are listed. This is a group conscience number 4. And the 3 kind of stages of chapter review is absorbing input, typing, and editing. And so we see where they are with chapters 2 and 3 being most complete. Something that I was aware of and certainly haven't talked about as much in just kind of the broader history presentation of the basic text is that there was a lot of effort put into personal stories. I've tended to focus on the 7th World Lit Conference as being where the work on personal stories was done, but they were doing a lot of work on it at other literature conferences, like here at the one in Santa Monica. And so there were instructions for reading and evaluating personal stories. 1, you're reading in groups of 3, and you were reading your story aloud. And then it lists some other things about major points in the outline and how to file. But the list used to label the story for the story file reflects this desire to make sure there was a diverse representation of stories. So they're tracking things and categorizing them related to gender, age, substance use, hospital or institution experience, diversity around LGBTQ, color, nationality, ethnicity, professional status, relapse, street user, rich, middle class. So they're really focusing on trying to make sure that there's kind of this diverse representation of stories. The outline for story reading and evaluation involved a number of stages. 1, identify kind of what they're using, places, feelings, behavior. What's their turning point? What was their bottom? How were they introduced to the NA program? What does their recovery look like? How did they make a decision? What specific actions did they take? What problems did they encounter? And then some general feedback about well-written stories, that there's a balance between using and recovery and so forth. And then there was directions for how stories should be edited. And so one of those things had to do with direct references to AA and AA literature. This is something that comes up in many of the literature conferences. How do we refer to this? It's something that's even being asked after the Seventh World Lit Conference when they're sending out stories for review. And at this point, they're saying we should refer to them as other 12-step programs. They had some questions in here about geographic locations, dates, but we've talked about this before, language, and this goes back to the handbook from the First World Lit Conference about omitting profanity. Presence of profanity would limit the availability of the literature in certain institutions and settings. You also have kind of an interesting thing on here about whether you use drug brand names. This is general input that was condensed for the minutes, and we've spent some time trying to determine, is this input that was sent in on the sheets from the Memphis Review Forum from the different groups, like they were talking about in the Lincoln, Nebraska newsletter of their weekly review of the material. If some of it is input that's been given since the conference started, we're not entirely sure, but I'm going to ask Mason to read through some of the ones that we highlighted that we thought were worth noting here.
Okay, so number one is a member suggests that the traditions should be deleted from the book as he considers them not relevant to early recovery. He further suggests that they be included in additional publication entitled The 12 Traditions. The second one was a member suggests that 1 to 2 year publication date be aimed at. It is further suggested that we have a publishable book and that an editor of the highest caliber be hired. Another one that stood out was a member wants a story from a gay addict to be included. The next one was a member was pleased that the word love was used so often in the book. The next one, some members object to the fact that personal stories do not differentiate but mix AA and NA recovery. Some members object to numerous references to AA, so we see that again. A member feels we should check with an attorney regarding the libel or slander possibilities with regards to pharmaceutical trade name, value, quaaludes, etc. Some members feel stories were not representative of NA as a whole, but only a small segment of NA. Some members felt the book needed more information on how to work with others.
So let's discuss any of these, Boyd, Francis, any of these that stood out to you that you wanted to comment on.
Well, I feel like we had this like ideal that we were striving for, but that we couldn't meet, and maybe it was because we didn't have the time to gather that many stories. But like we wanted international stories, but we didn't get any. Like we got one. There was one from Australia. It sounded like we wanted some LGBT stories, but I don't know that the like the earlier editions had those. But like we got all that in the 6th edition, which is kind of cool. But I think we had an ideal, but we didn't meet that ideal.
Thanks, Francis.
Yeah, Chris, I can't really add to anything on that. I like what Francis had put out, that, we had an ideal that we were working for, but we didn't quite meet it.
I think one of the things that makes an impression upon me from this input is the tension that is emerging around how to speak to or write about Alcoholics Anonymous, and recognizing that many people who had gotten into recovery either started in AA or continued to attend AA because there wasn't enough NA around them, and that there's this tension about how do we reference that when that's part of somebody's story, because as we've described previously, this is the writing of the basic text and the publication of the basic text really was a vehicle for Narcotics Anonymous separating from AA. And you can see some of those tensions that exist. You want to honor and respect what somebody's story is, but at the same time, some members are saying, we don't want this to be an AA story. We want this to be an NA story. We want to also give kind of
I think Mason was going to say something.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Mason.
Yeah, I was just going to make some comments on that slide. In the previous slide, I think it's interesting how the groundwork is laid out on what we want for the stories, but how that has been passed down ever since then as kind of a general direction on how we tell our stories in person now. And I find that interesting that that's sort of the framework, that's suggested to members on how they should communicate their stories, even in person, not just in the book. I thought that was interesting.
Appreciate
I would
that.
like to interject for a second, Chris. I'm sorry.
Yeah, please do.
But you were commenting about like what we do about the references to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I noticed in one of the earlier slides it said something about plagiarism, and like I see the language of the basic text and the language of Alcoholics Anonymous like kind of intermingled in the basic text. But one of the things, I think we have to acknowledge is that before the basic text, all we had was, like AA literature and AA sponsors. And so it's ingrained in, like the consciousness of the people that wrote the basic text. And like it's hard to get around, like because that's a part of the culture, but again, we're speaking to like this ideal of what we would like to do, but we're just not there. Not from the very start, but I think we're there now. Like when we read the Living Clean book, or or even the It Works How and Why. Like those are those are us moving towards that ideal of us being our own fellowship with our own language, and but we like we have to start somewhere, and so we start with the basic text, where there's where we see a lot of that language embedded in the basic text, and there's no getting around it because that's where we come from. Thanks,
Francis. Pulling excerpt from Group Conscience number 9, which was Thursday, April 30th at 10:30 p.m. And this is to get a better sense of how work was being done. And again, it's reflected in the minutes. So it gives us a sample of what the process was like. But there was a lot of discussion about this word chronic. And Dean, who was from Southern California and attended previous World Lit conferences, shared the desire to strike chronic from chapter 1. And the specific quote was, "Addiction is an incurable, chronic, progressive, and fatal disease characterized by the obsession to use drugs compulsively." That's in the minutes. And I'm just going to highlight a few things in here. Roger believed that the paragraph is controversial, that the definition is from the medical body, not from NA. George said this should be decided in a workshop. George said it wasn't chronic if it was fatal the first time. They wanted to have a dictionary definition read. And there was this kind of tension between, should this be explored and discussed in the workshop or in a group conscience? And Bo saying it should be in a workshop material, Leon saying, hey, the workshop felt like this is group conscience. So Dean suggested that we qualify the sentence by saying it was a clinical definition, and then why don't we have 3 versions? What's interesting here is Bo says we're taking too much time on this. He asks that the motion be withdrawn, the work continue in the workshop, and quote, when in doubt, leave it out. So a motion was made for 3 versions of the sentences to be presented. And the sentences were presented as: 1, addiction is an incurable, progressive, and fatal disease characterized by the obsession to use drugs compulsively. 2, addiction is an incurable, chronic, progressive, and sometimes fatal disease characterized by the obsession to use drugs compulsively. And the original, which is number 3, addiction is an incurable, chronic, progressive, and fatal disease characterized by the obsession to use drugs compulsively. And so when this was brought to a vote, you had one person vote for number 1, 30 people voted for number 2, and 15 voted for number 3. Bo said that this is time wasted. And he says there are people dying out there. And I want to come back to this in just 1 second. But when we look at this process, we can think about, well, what did it look like when it was finally published? And it didn't quite look like any of those 3. But the way it reads in the first edition of the basic text is, addicts, we have an incurable disease called addiction, which is chronic, progressive, and fatal. But I'd like to pause for a second and talk about Bo's position about kind of wasting time on this. Addicts are out there dying and so forth. And wanted to hear from you guys any thoughts or reflections that you had about that mindset that he had at this conference.
Well, yeah, Chris, I think it's very obvious that Bo really and truly from the original letter that he wrote right before the conference, that his intentions were hopefully that this book would be completed by the end of this conference so that they could hopefully get it approved and then publication in June. And so Bo's pretty antsy about this, and he's got the mindset that it's never going to be perfect, and feels that the committee is holding it back because they want it perfect. So that's why he's, I see that's why he's in there saying that, look, we're wasting time here. This is something that needs to be done in a workshop. So that's where Bo's head was at.
Thanks, Boyd.
Yeah, I think Boyd hit the nail on the head. I don't have anything to add to that.
I think that he probably knew more about what was going on than a lot of the people did, like where the finances were at and how much money it was costing to get the book. And, so like, I know that the cadence of the conferences started speeding up, but and some of that, a lot of that had to do with, like addicts were dying and we needed to get this done. But I almost wonder if it was in his mind is like, are we going to be able to get this done? Like this is such a huge task to overcome. And then, like they're wanting to get it done by the end of this conference. And, like, was that a heartbreak for him? Like when it didn't happen? Or did he know about it going into it? Like I kind of question, like, does he, like we got to use this energy to get as much as we possibly can done. But, I don't know, I'm not trying to argue with Boyd, but like, I question, like if he knew it wasn't going to happen on this one. Thanks.
Yeah, I've wondered a fair amount. So on one hand, we talk about the writing the basic text at the first World Lit Conference in October '79, but for Bo, this has really started in October '77. So, he's 3.5 years or so into this, more. And, in his book, The Story of the Basic Text, he describes after the Third World Lit Conference in Memphis coming home to an empty house and, seeing some of the costs associated with him devoting so much time to the writing of the book. And so, yeah, I think if I'm putting myself in his shoes versus somebody who's coming to their first World Lit Conference in Santa Monica, I would be, maybe fatigued a little bit and ready for this thing to be over. Ready to kind of move on. So it's probably a lot of different things, but I also imagine that there's a great deal of patience that has to take place you've been doing this for a long time. You've got so many new people showing up and participating and asking questions probably about why is this done this way, and so forth. And so it's, yeah, just a lot to speculate on. So we know that the conference went a day longer than anticipated. So group conscience number 10 was May 1st of 81 at 2:30 p.m. This is from the most complete set of minutes that we have. The group conscience number 10 states that there would be a group conscience at midnight, which would presumably be number 11, but we don't see any further minutes. So don't know if they just ended after the 10th or if they had this one later on, but wanted to highlight a few things in it. First of all is a review of where the different chapters stand, such as chapter 1 is in final form. Chapter 2 is about 15 minutes from completion in the second editing workshop, and so forth. So we get this kind of review of where we are with the work, also with personal stories and where release forms need to be signed, and new stories contributed from San Francisco. But here are kind of the important things. One, Bo announced that the World Service Conference will be held this weekend. So it was actually starting that Friday, May 1st, that evening. And by this point, he does recognize that there's a need for another lit conference. And he shares that he's planning on resigning as chair of the literature committee. He felt his replacement should be someone who was experienced and was probably present in the room. He also felt that the committee was hanging on to the book. We'll never get it perfect. He goes on to suggest Fort Lauderdale as a potential conference site, so that it could occur in conjunction with the World Convention being held in Miami in September. And again, this hanging on to the book, like if somebody's showing up to their first, like Nikki or Sally showing up to their first conference, can't imagine that it would feel like hanging on to it for them. They're just getting involved. But imagine for someone like Bo who's been working on this for so long that he could. He also says that he's asked the Board of Trustees to compare the first and second versions of the traditions, and he'd like to get their feedback that they could perform a valuable service. And so it speaks to other people who had a role in reviewing and contributing to the final material in the basic text, who may not have been in attendance at all the literature conferences. Any comments on these items?
Yeah, I find it interesting that Bo has got his foot on the gas about certain things, like going back to the chronic debate. But once it's apparent that the book's not going to be finished, it seems to be okay to have the board of trustees review the traditions and give their input. So in a sense, like frustration from spinning our wheels on certain things, but then also still taking the time to like include the board of trustees on the review of the traditions.
Thanks, Mason. Lloyd or Francis, anything to add?
No, nothing to add from me, Chris.
I don't have anything.
All right. Another real significant thing that happens here, and it's a little unclear, but we'll explore the sources, is that there was material that was lost. And this doesn't appear in the minutes of the Fourth World Lit Conference, at least not in the version that we have. But both Bo and Bob Stone report that material was left in the typing area one night and was lost or stolen. So Bob Stone, in My Years with NA, describes the material as being stolen. Bo, in his book, The Story of the Basic Text, says it was either lost or stolen. And then Jim, who wrote A Matter of Principle, takes a slightly different perspective, which is no one really knows how the Santa Monica final draft files got lost. Roger traveled around for a month or so on the West Coast with a couple of other members, during which time the draft files were stored here and there, and later they were shipped to me. So kind of regardless of what happened, what do you think it was like for the people involved to have put so much time and energy in this to have files lost?
Well, it's got to be heartbreaking. Just simple as that, you know.
And I wonder if it also led to any kind of distrust or, questions about, people's motives and so forth.
Of course.
Yeah, I imagine they went through all sort of range of human emotions over that. Uh, I just find it so fascinating that, eventually they kind of dust themselves off and just accept reality for what it is and get back to work. It's just be so easy, all the time, energy, and effort at that point just to say, "Hey, we gave it a shot," but they don't do that. The perseverance is there.
And sadly, this will not be the last time that material's lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it also adds another literature conference to the mix. We see in one of the last slides is that Bo was talking about going to Fort Lauderdale, which is sixth. But once the draft is lost, that's probably the decision to have the next one in Warren, Ohio, and then the next one in Fort Lauderdale. So that's another expense, more time put in, starting over, getting reorganized. That would have was a tough loss.
So we first see the lost work referenced in the minutes on day one of the Fifth World Conference, Literature Conference. And what's written is a little bit difficult to interpret, but Roger said the first 5 chapters of the book were lost. They'd been through the second edit and an original typed. The original was lost. The other 5 had been through input and partial second edit. Our first priority is get the first 5 chapters retyped and the second 5 typed up in the form they are. So again, not entirely clear what that actually entails, but it's the first actual reference to the material from Santa Monica being lost. So again, May 1st is the last day that we have minutes from the Fourth World Lit Conference. It's also the start that evening of the 1981 World Service Conference, which was the 6th World Service Conference. And at that conference, Bo is elected to vice chair of the World Service Conference, and Joseph is elected as treasurer of the World Service Conference, and Roger becomes elected as chair of the World Service Conference Literature Committee. This is a Memphis review form that was at the World Service Conference and signed by a number of people. And then we see that, as things have wrapped up, plans start going into place for this Fifth World Lit Conference. And so Jim M. decides to offer to host it in Warren, Ohio. The dates being July 29th or June 29th to July 5th. And then in an effort to be supportive of Roger in his new role, Jim invites Roger to come live with he and his family on the family farm. So that kind of gets us through the content, but I want to kind of get into any concluding thoughts. And one that I'll kick off for you guys is, this uncertainty about when is it good enough? When is this good enough to be published? Any thoughts on kind of that? Because we've got Bo saying we've put a ton of work into this already. The fellowship's reviewed it. And you've got some first-time voices showing up saying, hey, this really needs a professional editor.
Is it ever good enough? We have 6 editions. We have 2 third editions. There's it wasn't a perfect book when we started, but I think that we've approached it being as good as it gets until there's a new batch of stories that we need. But there aren't any other books with so many editions. There's some just for the days that are different, but not like the basic text. And so maybe it was kind of a reflection of what Sally was saying, that it's nearly impossible to write a book through committee, but like it's obvious that God was involved with it, like and still involved with it. And like I can't even tell you how much controversy there is around the basic text. Like you're either not liking like you love the gray book, and like the third edition revised, and you hate the sixth edition, or you love the sixth edition and you're like like there's still a lot of controversy around it. And is it ever perfect?
Thanks, Francis.
That's the point I was going to make, Francis. There's a large majority of the fellowship today who prefers the gray book, and it was meant to be a review form. And I would imagine a lot of people have found their way to recovery and identified with recovery through that gray review form, and that was only meant to be the review form. So, maybe it was good enough before they got to Santa Monica.
Oh no, Mason, I'm gonna have to put in there that maybe in your part of the country, a large part of the fellowship has gotten, enamored with it, but I don't necessarily know that it's that way around here. Um,
Large was probably the wrong word.
yeah, I
A,
picked up
por-
on it. That's
a
for sure.
portion,
A portion.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it persists as something that is of importance to a segment of the fellowship.
it does. It does. It is. Um, yeah, I mean, I really, while studying this, kind of looked at the fourth as, a conference where it was pretty much fine tuning the input that came in. Bo was hoping that it certainly would be towards the end, but obviously they discovered that it just didn't they didn't do enough, or it wasn't there enough. I remember somehow or another and I'm gonna paraphrase this, that Sally Evans had said that, somebody had said, Sally, you're college educated. What do you think about all this, the particular writing? And she says, well, it's not very grammatically correct, but I've talked with people on the committee about it, and they say something like, well, God will correct it, and just continue moving on. But it, I don't know. To me, it's the writing of the basic text is quite an interesting journey, and I just remember reading Bo's book, My Story of the Basic Text. And, for me at the end of it, it was kind of like watching the hand of God work through everybody. So,
I wonder, as I said, one way to think about this lit conference is the California Fellowship meets the Literature Committee. And my reflections on it is that seems like it is a very necessary step to get broader support for the book, that it needed to go through a process of people getting exposed to it, getting exposed to the conference, culture and way of working, to develop broader support, as opposed to if the book was just presented, it's ready for the service conference, World Service Conference, to vote on it. So I think, to me, it may not have met what Bo was hoping for in terms of we're going to get this approved right away, but it seems like it was a necessary step in consensus building and support for it. Any other concluding thoughts from anybody?
Well, I I want to I like to think that um, three was kind of like the climax of the whole thing, where the gray review form came out, but this is the midpoint, right? Number four, there's five, six, and seven, and and like they went into if this was a football game, they went to the away field, and I think they left it all in the field. They may not have won the game, but they left with their head high, and and they did a great job, and they eventually got it done. So, yay, team! Roll Tide.
Good analogy, Francis. I like that.
Well, that may be a good stopping point, and we'll be gathering again soon to do a deep dive into the 5th, 6th, and 7th World Lit Conferences that are all coming up on their 45th anniversaries. And just want to say, really appreciate you guys being willing to participate in preserving this history in a deeper kind of detail and degree than previous for people who'd be interested in learning about it.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I certainly want to say thank you for creating this wonderful PowerPoint and deep dive, and it's an honor to participate. Thank you.
Thanks, Boyd. Thanks,
This was
Mason.
a great
Thanks, Francis.
honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.